beyond those included in the syllabus. The theme of this second edition of Conclave is India at 75, Learn Together to Grow Together. Today, we have with us four speakers who will present their views on three different topics. Ms. Komal Das and Ms. Shubhachari from TYBA Philosophy will deliberate on the topic Ethics in Sports. They have been guided by Assistant Professor Ms. Sandra Pereira. Then Ms. Josette Nazare from TYBA Psychology will speak on the topic Counseling for Well-being. She has been mentored by Assistant Professor Ms. Cindy De Silva. And Ms. Natasha Martha Fernandez will talk on the topic The Progression of Food in India. She has been mentored by Assistant Professor Ms. Priyanka Naik. This session will be chaired by Ms. Astrid Savia Pereira. I request Professor Mohit Suktankar to formally introduce today's chairperson to the audience.
Thank you so much, sir. It is my high privilege to introduce our chairperson for today. We have a very illustrious personality among us, so I will formally introduce her. Her name is Miss Astrid Savia Pereira. She is currently working at St. Xavier's College as instructor in physical education. She did her BA from St. Xavier's College. She has a diploma in sports coaching, that is in football, from Netaji Subhash National Institute of Sports, Kolkata. She is qualified coach. She has D and C license in coaching in football, and also completed her coaching at which is verified by FIFA, AFC, and AIFF. She has represented the state in football team at 30 different times at senior nationals. She has represented her school, higher secondary, college, and university in athletics, football, handball, basketball, netball, baseball, cricket, hockey, tennis, taekwondo, judo, badminton, table tennis, and many other sports. Also, she has won a long list of awards like Best Sportswoman at state, national, and international level. So we have a very, very apt personality who is going to be the chairperson for today's session. I welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for sparing your time and joining us and chairing this session. I think now we can start the session. So I call upon the first set of speakers, Miss Komal Das and Miss Shubhachari. They are students of TYBA Philosophy Honors, and they will be deliberating on the topic, that is ethics in sports. So students, I hand over to you all. You all may start.
Good morning, Mohit. Thank you for introducing me. Looking forward for insightful deliberations.
Good morning, one and all present over here, and welcome to Conclave 2020. Myself, Komal Das, from Philosophy Department, TYBA student, with my fellow mate Shubhachari, will be presenting on the topic Ethics in Sports. Some of the subtitles which we'll be undergoing today are as follows: Introduction, Role of Ethics in Sports, Importance of Ethics in Sports, Various associations that governs the sports law, Unethical behavior in sports, Common common ethics issues in sports, Examining ethical issues in youth and college sports. Introduction. What is ethics? Ethics, or moral philosophy, is a branch of philosophy that involves systemizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior. In other words, ethics is a branch of philosophy that deals with the rightness and wrongness with moral consequences of human action. Now, sometimes we tend to lose an argument and we try to counter by saying, "Where is your ethics?" or "Speak ethical." To speak ethical is to provide honest facts with integrity and without deception or distortion. So, here we conclude that ethics is primarily used in our daily lives and it is applicable in different concepts. One such concept that we'll be handling today is ethics in sports. How ethics plays a great role in our daily lives. Ethics applies to all aspects of conduct and is relevant to the action of individuals, groups, and organizations. Ethics helps in everyday decision making. Ethics is applied in various aspects. One such is ethical issues in sports. Working towards excellence in sports can produce incredible gratification. But what happens when the drive to win overtakes respect for the rules of the game? Or outside interference in sports leads to wrong or fabricated results. When we go against ethics of a particular game, or when we disrespect the rules of a game just to win or gain gratification, is it ethical? Next, we have importance of ethics in sports. Ethics is important in sports as much as it is important in daily life. Ethics in sports mostly requires these virtues: fairness, integrity, responsibility, and respect. When we say fairness, treating all people equally and applying reasonable punishments only when rules are broken. When we speak about integrity, for instance, informing a cashier that you have given too much of change is another example of integrity. Another such example will be if a player playing football from an outside offside position, and if he claims that he is an offside position can also be a term of integrity. Responsibility, something you're expected to do, being responsible enough for a task. Respect, respect is nothing but just to honor someone or either respect to players amongst themselves or the referees or coaches. Strong ethical principles in athletics. Sports communicate respect for everyone involved in a sport: the athletes, the fans, the coaches, and so on. Ethical behavior in sports can refer to: 1. Protecting the health of athletes. 2. Following the rules. 3. Respecting opponents. 4. Demonstrating self control in the face of frustration or defeat. 5. Taking responsibility for one's mistake and not blaming others. And last one is not trying to gain unfair advantages. Next, we have various associations that governs the sports law in India. The first one we have Sports Law and Welfare Association of India. Next is Sports Authority of India. Third one is Sports Broadcasting Law in India. Next we have Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports. And last, National Sports Federation of India. Apart from this, different rules are associated with different games in different states of a country. The next slide we have unethical behavior in sports. Is today's sports, with all the money, commercialization, drug abuse, and bribing, still ethical? The most important thing in the Olympic Games is not winning, but taking part. The essential thing in life is not conquering, but fighting well. This phrase was said by the founder of the Olympic, Baron Pierre de Coubertin. Nowadays, it seems like everyone is just interested in medals. In fact, sport is all about money. You can be better, stronger, and more successful. But what about ethics? Sport is sometimes involves more about money than the true competition of the fittest. Therefore, unethical behavior in sport industry has increased rapidly. Uh, did you know where actually the unethical behavior emerges? It starts from players to referees and to the organizers or to the authority. Even with respect to fans, the moment any team loses, the public or the fans create violence. This shouldn't be happening. The most concerned unethical behavior among players is using enhancing drugs, doping controls in various sports, and so on. In further slides, we'll go in depth of some unethical behavior in sports. Perhaps I hand over to Shubhachari, the next speaker of the day. Thank you, Komal. Common ethical issues in sports. First, we have diversity. In recent years, through public scrutiny means critical observation or examination has turned to diversity among coaches or even with respect to the other staff. Due to diversity, only certain group or caste is being considered, neglecting others. Next, we have pay for play. Athletes and coaches may be involved in bribery or to offer some amount of compromise and corruption due to the due to drive to win at all cost. In order to win gratification in the game, these tools are being used to achieve success. Next, we have drug use and abuse in sports. There are drugs that enhance athletes' performance and they are called performance enhancing drug, also called as anabolic steroids. Athletes who are detected and found guilty of drug use have witnessed their medals being stripped down. Next, we have gender equity. This gender discrimination is seen from ages. There is no such gender equity. Mostly, female are being less nurtured and have fewer opportunities to participate in the sports. But those who manage sports program for minors, athletes have both legal and ethical obligation to follow Title IX rules, which ensures male and females have equal opportunities to participate in athletics. Next, we have bullying. The prevalence of bullying has gained attention in recent years. A number of hazing incidents in interscholastic sports have highlighted the need for athletic department to be vigilant and develop comprehensive prevention plans. Next, we have using a bona fide athletes. One of the cheating practices in an attempt to win at all cost is the fielding of non-bona fide athletes who are not meant for a particular event or undue competitive advantages over the opponent. For example, non-bona fide athletes can be overaged, hired to play with underaged, or a better example will be non-university students playing as a full registered university student. Next, we have inflicting pain or injury on an opponent. Inflicting pain or injury on an opponent with the intention of knocking him or her out of the game, like the Saints Bounty scandal. Some even convert personal faults, such as grabbing a player underwater during a water polo match in order to gain unfair sports-related advantages over an opponent and to win by all means. Violence and hooliganism. First, first off, we need to know what is hooliganism. It's an act of violent or rowdy behavior by young athletes seen to be more violent and play contrary to the sports rules and ethics. Athletes who are losing have been seen to be more violent and play contrary to sports rules and ethics. Sometimes, sports organizers and security personnel have been faced with challenge of controlling fans whose teams or athletes lost a match. They sometimes exhibit violent behaviors. Some athletes or teams with their fans have been found destroying sports facilities and causing harm to other sports and participants because they could not win a particular sports. Next, we we have fixing of match and manipulation of result. Some team managers may not want to compete with the particular team at the preliminaries, and the best way to avoid it is through fixing a match. Athlete or team officials, for the purpose of winning a tournament for oneself or others, for interest of the one doing the manipulation. Fixing match involves soliciting and giving undue athletic advantages to a particular athlete or team before competition. Some officials sometimes manipulate the sports results in favor of particular athletic team. Next, we have examining ethical issues in youth and college sports. In In youth sports, the goal is to character development and ethical concerns center on working hard, honor, teamwork, diligence, courage, and self-discipline. In sports, the goal is to win through efforts and excellence rather than by cheating. College sports administrators who coordinate the athletic programs, coach teams, or manage players' recruitment confront ethical decisions every day regarding athletic performance, student athlete behavior on and off the field, equitable treatment of student athlete academic performance, team management. Today's colleges and universities make a great deal of money from their sports program. They also spend maintenance large amount to maintain those programs. This creates unethical behaviors in sports. Two common ethical issues in college sports include recruitment practices. Recruiters must follow specific rules when when contacting high schools athletes. While they can offer scholarships, they cannot give gift and money. These rules are maintained to feel free from bribe and pressure. Recruitment students should be based on skills to succeed academically in the schools. Younger athletes require thoughtful guidance and support when they participate in sports. They not only need someone to teach them rules but also an adult model with positive attitudes. So also to teach them about fair play. Sports have great potential to teach important life lessons. However, students athletes need responsible coaches to instill values that will allow them to both enjoy sports and grow. Applying ethical coaching practices can make a huge impact on an athletic programs, especially when it involves athletes who are minor. By focusing holistically on development of minor athletes, coaches help them reach their greatest potential within the sports. By setting developmentally appropriate goals and planning strategically, coaches can empower minor athletes to succeed. By modeling ethical behavior in sports, coaches can prepare students to respond appropriately during practices and competition. By creating a safe, respectful environment free and abuse, coaches create the conditions for minors athletes to learn from their mistakes. We would like to conclude with a quote. Sportsmanship is the ethical and moral dimension of sports. It is demonstrated by a number of attributes and attitudes such as fair play, respect for the rules and tradition of the sports, and various traits of good character including integrity, demonstrated respect for others including teammates, opponents, officials and spectators, accountability, self-control and graciousness in the victory and defeat. Quote by Michael Josephson. So these are the references which we have utilized in our presentation. We express our gratitude towards Conclave as whole, the organizers, the chairpersons, IQAC committee, the MP College of Arts and Science, Miramar, Goa. I also thank our HOD Ma'am Roshida from Philosophy Department, Ma'am Sandra for guiding us, and our beloved audience for listening patiently. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.
Thank you, Miss Komal and Miss Shubha. Uh, Congratulations on this great presentation. I would also like to thank the mentor, Miss Sandra Pereira, for ably guiding our students, and also thanks to the entire philosophy department. Uh, Now we move on to the next presentation. But just before the presentation, I would like to inform the audience that if they have any questions, they can put it in the chat box. And at the end of all the three presentations, we will ask these questions to the respective speakers. So now I think we can move on to the next speaker. So I invite Ms. Josette Nazare, a student of TYBA Psychology Honors, and she will be speaking on the topic counseling for well-being. Over to you, Jajal.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. My name is Josette Nazare from TYBA Psychology, and my topic for today's presentation is counseling for well-being. In this, I will be talking about what counseling is, the stigma and myths that are attached to counseling, why it is normal to go see a counselor even if someone may not be dealing with issues, and the significance of counseling for healthy living. So let's begin. So, what is counseling? Counseling is a form of talk therapy that takes place in a safe and non judgmental environment. So, it is a process where a person or a couple or family as a whole can go meet up with a qualified professional counselor, and they can talk about things that either issues that they have, difficulties, or situations that they're finding difficult to deal with, and this takes place in an environment which is safe and non-judgmental. So the information disclosed during the session is kept confidential with the opportunity to freely share their views, be heard, and gain new insights. So people are also allowed to talk without having any worry about what the counselor will think of them, since it is non-judgmental, and in doing so they also gain clarity about any possible questions that they have. Counseling is a professional relationship between the counselor and the person, and the counselor helps clients by working on strategies that help them overcome their difficulties that they're facing. People can choose to go visit a counselor for a variety of reasons. Some people may find it difficult to express their emotions in general, and some people may feel like they have no one to talk to, and others feel like they have no one who wants to listen to their personal issues, or they're always met with with answers like your problems are not the end of the world, and so people choose to go visit a counselor. Others may want to speak to a qualified professional who is capable of providing them with a viewpoint that is objective. And additionally, people also have real issues that they may want to resolve, and these can be issues related to their life or their work, or just aspects of their personality that they want to change, thinking patterns. So suppose some people find themselves thinking very negatively, or their thinking is counterproductive, they may go to a counselor and try to change their thinking styles. They see things more optimistically. And also, people who want to learn how to cope with or prepare to cope with major life events also choose to see a counselor. Next, we move on to the stigma and myths attached to counseling. So, stigma is defined as negative views or discrimination against an individual or a group that is made on the basis of a distinguishing characteristic. So, stigma can be divided into social stigma and self perceived stigma, wherein social stigma in this case relates to society's perception of people that go to therapy or counseling, as it is still seen as having a mental illness, so that the person is crazy or something similar. And social stigma can also lead to self-perceived stigma, which is an internalized stigma. So because people do not want to seem like they're ill, they do not want others to think of them as they're crazy, and so people often avoid going to counseling because they feel that they're going to be considered as weak. So next, this brings us to the myths attached to counseling. The first myth is that counseling is only meant for people with serious mental illness. This is a myth because the truth behind this is that counseling is meant for anyone and everyone. It is true that people with issues and problems do go to a counselor to resolve them, but people can also visit a counselor for other reasons, like how to deal with stress or cope with major events or major life changes, and even things like grief. The second myth is that counseling is a quick fix to all problems. The reality behind this is that there is no such thing as a quick fix. Strengthening your mind is very much like strengthening your body, so it takes a lot of time, a lot of patience and persistence. So there may be times where people feel like they can't do it anymore or they want to give up, but you have to keep going if you want to see the results. Third myth is that mental health issues are not real problems and counselors are not reputable doctors. So, mental health issues, as we know now, they are very much real, and we see how they affect different aspects of our lives, like our behaviors and like even our eating patterns and our social behaviors are also affected. And mental health professionals or counselors are people that have undergone extensive training in their field, and they have studied a lot because they're dealing with humans and human emotion, so they are reputable and they do know what they are doing. So the fourth myth is that a counselor is not needed, as we can discuss our problems with family members and friends. While social support is important to everyone, the relationship that we have with our family members and friends is different to that of the one we have with the counselor. As mentioned before, the relationship with the counselor is a professional relationship wherein you can freely discuss whatever you're going through, and the counselor also has a specific skill set, so they're not going to judge you and everything's confidential. Whereas if you're discussing your issues with your family or your friends, there's always going to be some, you're always going to not talk about certain things because you feel like you can't discuss it with them, so open discussion is not uh, able to happen. And also with the counselor you can express truly what you're feeling without having to censor anything. And fifth, it is unnecessary since we can turn to our elders or religious people for advice and answers. We are often told that our elders and religious people have the answers to everything. They're the wisest people we can go to, and that counseling is not needed at all. So a lot of people actually go to them in times of stress or difficulty, but we have to realize that in these cases our elders can only give us advice from their own experience, and religious people can only advise us according to what they believe in, so we're not getting an objective answer. Also uh, they are again biased, and they will take things seriously if you say something they cannot like. So next is why it is normal to go for counseling without having mental health issues or serious problems. So serious problems over here would relate to like our preconceived notions of why people go to counseling, so which is again part of the stigma, like without, so why you can go to counseling if you're not dealing with any major thing like depression or anxiety. So counseling helps in many ways to improve people's well-being. So your well-being is the state of happiness or comfort or health, and it also includes other aspects like how satisfied people are with their lives. So with respect to relationships, how happy you are with your interpersonal relationships or your work or your strengths. So, counseling helps in the following ways. It helps enrich interpersonal relationships. So, through counseling, we learn how to improve our communication skills. So, we learn how to become more sensitive to our feelings as well as other people's feelings. And we also learn how to become more mindful about what we're saying, so we don't end up like in a fit of rage hurting people. We always think before saying things, and also we become better listeners. So we treat people with value, and that helps enrich our interpersonal relationships. Next is it is effective stress relief. So stress is an inevitable part of life, but the way we respond to stress and the way we cope with stress is what affects our emotional well being. So, a counselor helps offer the tools and resources for a person to identify their stress points. So, what causes them stress, or which incidences they have experienced stress. The counselor will help the person identify these, and then they can work together and develop healthier coping mechanisms. So the coping mechanisms will be subjective, as each person deals with problems a different way. These coping mechanisms will be altered according to the individual, so it is managed in a way that the person can help that the person will reduce the impact of stress that they feel, or completely eliminate it. Then is engaging in less healthy behaviors, in less unhealthy behaviors it should be. So sometimes we engage in negative behaviors that interfere with our lives, and we tend to waste a lot of time on them. So once we recognize these unhealthy behaviors and we visit the counselor, they can help us identify why we are developing these behaviors, and we can find ways to change that and engage in more healthful behaviors. Then counseling also helps us realize our strengths. So through counseling, we are enabled to focus on our strengths and cultivate our strengths, while also recognizing and being aware of our weaknesses. So like knowing our strengths and cultivating them is helpful, because it changes the way we see ourselves. We will automatically start embracing our capabilities, and we will also experience an increase in self esteem. And recognizing our weaknesses also makes us more self aware. Then, building resilience. So, resilience is a person's ability to overcome difficult or adverse situations, or in other words, it's someone's ability to bounce back from a situation. And counseling helps by it helps the person reframe their thoughts to look for ways to deal with the situation, instead of like stressing over it. And we also learn how to focus on what we can control, rather than being in an overwhelmed state. And like mentioned before, we can also learn more effective stress management methods. So through building resilience, people are prepared to face inevitable difficult situations before they even occur. So the significance of counseling in healthy living. Counseling provided by trained professional can have immense impact on a person's life. It helps us develop attitudes that are more accepting and open. We often feel like we are defined by our mistakes or our past, but counselors help us see that some things are not in our control, and our past really doesn't define us, and how we can learn from these mistakes to make better decisions in the future. So they also help us realize that we can learn to accept ourselves for our flaws and strengths. And our emotions are also improved, as many a times we have repressed feelings that we find openly, but once we let out these bottled up emotions, we feel a lot of relief, and things automatically seem to look good to us. So when we are in this state of positivity, our behaviors are also improved. And finally, we also learn new skills that help us cope with difficult feelings or situations. And these skills make us capable enough to deal with our own problems and face our problems. So, in conclusion, counseling is not about seeking advice from your counselor or expecting them to solve your problems, but counseling helps people to help themselves by making them more aware of their thoughts, emotional states, and strengths, and how to channel them in different life situations. And these are the references. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miss Nazare, for the wonderful presentation, for shedding light on the stigma around counseling and also busting a few myths uh, on counseling. I would also like to thank your mentor, Dr. Cindy De Silva, for guiding and, of course, mentoring you. And also, I would like to extend thanks to the entire Department of Psychology. Now we move on to the final speaker of the day, Ms. Natasha Fernandez. She is second year student from the Department of Biotechnology, and her topic is progression of food in India from ingredient to dish. I would like to invite Ms. Natasha to start with her topic, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, sir. A very good morning to everyone present here. I am Natasha Fernandez from second year BSc Biotechnology. And today, I'm going to be talking about an uncanny, rather bizarre topic. It's something all of us can relate to, and it's something close to a lot of our hearts, and that is food. The American novelist Jonathan Safran Foer once said, "Food is not rational. Food is culture, habit, craving, and identity." Today, I have chosen to speak about the progression of food in India from ingredient to dish. We see all these banners saying India at 75. What is the first thing that pops into your head? Most of us would probably think of the progress of India with respect to education, sanitation, roads, development, etc. But the last thing we fail to notice, or rather take for granted, is the progression of food in India, which is a paramount part of India's or any country's culture for that matter. It is important to remember that though we have been widely influenced by other cultures, we have still stayed true to our own culture and traditions. You can pretty much demarcate each state based on the food they eat, since the food eaten and the ingredients used in each state is so diverse, as is seen on this particular slide. In the Northeast, people uniquely use bamboo to make a variety of dishes, including muya avanru. In the North, we have dishes like chole bhatura, rogan josh, tandoori chicken, all of which are widely known throughout India. In the West, we have dishes like dokla, chaat, vada pav, etc. And in the South, we have vegetable stew, dosa, idli, sambar, and many other dishes. India is variegated when it comes to its food and its ingredients. The ingredients used primarily depend on the local climate and soil, which determines the type of crops that are grown. As you can see in this slide, in the north, wheat is predominantly grown, while in the south, rice is grown. Culture, traditions, and religion also play a crucial role in the preparation of food. In Goa, for instance, rice is a mainstream crop due to its hot and humid climate. This is the reason why most Goans incorporate rice into their conventional diet. But then again, Goan food differs from the food in Kerala, despite both these states having similar climatic conditions. The distinction between the food in these two states boils down to the culture and traditions of the people populating these areas. Now, in this slide, the foods to the right are foods that are commonly eaten in Kerala, and the foods to your left are the foods that are commonly eaten in Goa. In fact, even in the same state, the preparations of the same dishes widely differ. Let's take, for example, chicken shakuti. Depending on whether you live in Diwar or Moljam or Betul, the preparation alters, even though they all have the common name shakuti. Religion also plays a role in the food that is being eaten. Goan Hindu and Christian food are distinct from each other. Christian Goan food draws influences from British, Portuguese, Saraswat, and South Indian cuisines. Every Goan dish has 4 important elements: sweetness, sourness, spice, and salt. Hindu Goan cuisine can be quite different from Christian Goan cuisine, but it still contains these elements and makes use of tamarind and kokum, while Christians use vinegar to get a tangy flavor. Now, Before I get into the crux of my topic, I will be sharing with you all a little bit of history. For those of you who liked history back in high school, that's good, great. But for those of you who haven't, bear with me. I tried to make it as interesting as possible. 15th August 1947. After decades of revolts, mutinies, and freedom struggles, India finally achieved its independence. Now you would think that the British is gone, India is independent. It can't get better than that, right? Wrong. The British left India with a bloody partition of British India into India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Added to this was the prevalent problem of hunger. The issue was that the British had covered up the Bengal famine, which occurred in 1943, which is 4 years before India got its independence. During that time, the British were in maximal control, and supplies were being sent from India to aid the soldiers in the World War, which happened from 1939 to 1945. The Bengal famine had a massive impact on the hunger situation in India. In fact, its impact is underestimated. At the time of independence, we had campaigns glorifying the idea of eating sweet potatoes, which was weird since sweet potatoes weren't a part of people's regular diets. The idea of making rotis with 25% sweet potato and 75% wheat was perpetuated. Why? Because there was a shortage of rice and wheat in our country. This was done to lower the demand as the production was quite less. The government implemented all sorts of food policies and media campaigns to alleviate the hunger situation. After the crop failures in the 1950s, India resorted to the Green Revolution, which increased the production of food grains massively due to the use of high-yielding varieties, resulting in an increase in agricultural production to combat food shortage and increase the revenue of the agricultural sector. Next, we had the White Revolution, which involved the Operation Flood that enhanced the production of milk and also resulted in the increased animal input that went into the dairy industry. The White Revolution saw a huge increase in the productivity of the dairy industry. Next was the Blue Revolution. This involved the adoption of a package program to increase the production of marine and fish products. The Blue Revolution resulted in a huge boom in aquaculture and featured extremely productive agricultural activity. Then we had the Yellow Revolution, which involved a sudden increase in the production of edible oil, which was achieved through the plantation of hybrid oil seeds. The Yellow Revolution also involved complementary technologies for oil production. Lastly, we had the Golden Revolution, which involved a significant increase in the production of fruits, honey, vegetables, and other important horticultural products. In 1971, the Minister of Agriculture had announced that it would stop importing grains from the US, which was a great feat for India at the time. Well, the problem today, and the problem even in 1971, is that we are barely sufficient. Sure, the production of food grains has increased drastically, but distribution has always been a major problem. Another issue is that India does not have a policy of making sure that food is distributed or provided to its citizens before it exports. All these factors have led to hunger still prevailing in India, added to which are nutritional deficiencies because of the lack of safe and nutritious food. The reason why I spoke about a little history, maybe a lot, is because this is what influenced and still influences the kinds of foods Indians eat, or rather the kinds of ingredients that are used to cook. I say this because Indians had to adapt to the circumstances or the period in which they were living. To give you an example, carbohydrates like sweet potatoes were encouraged after independence, which was not such a common ingredient to cook with at that time, all because there was an insufficiency in food grains. Similarly, during droughts, there would have been a shift in the kinds of food people ate, probably from food grains to more easy grown millets and legumes, which can grow under low moisture conditions. Rice was a food grain that was only consumed by the rich, while wheat was eaten by the common folk. It was only after independence and after there was surplus production of rice in the country that rice was eaten by the middle class. It was during this time that the consumption of millets and legumes had considerably decreased. When it came to influencing and propagating Indian cuisine, the British and the Portuguese weren't all that bad. Well, they did introduce crops like potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, peanuts, cauliflowers, sweet potatoes, cashews, and guavas, which have become staples in some parts of India. I mean, think about it. Can you even imagine Indian cooking without potatoes, tomatoes, and chilies? No, they are quintessential to Indian cuisine. Sure, a few dishes may not use these ingredients, but they are memorable. They also introduced the concept of baking. They played a vital role in propagating Indian cuisine throughout the globe. Many cuisines worldwide are somehow influenced by Indian cuisine. During the partition of India, we did lose a lot of our cultural heritage. But at the same time, new dishes and styles of cooking were being introduced. The Mughlai cuisine was one such cuisine that was fading in India because of the migration of people due to the partition, and because the people at the time, especially youngsters, preferred eating cheaper kebabs. Therefore, the restaurants that did sell kebabs cooked the Mughlai style closed. You must be wondering what I'm talking about, since in most Indian restaurants, you have dishes classified under the so-called Mughlai cuisine. Well, this isn't Mughlai cuisine. Mughlai cuisine involves refined spicing and cooking in yogurt. Foods supposedly classified as Mughlai nowadays originated from Punjab. They are essentially tomato, onion, garlic gravies which are bursting with umami. Now we have chaat. There are those who say that the word chaat originated from its literal meaning to lick. It was so delicious that people licked their fingers and the bowl made of peepal leaves called donas, in which it is often served. The story of its origin goes like this. During the reign of Emperor Shah Jahan in the 16th century, there was an outbreak of cholera. Desperate attempts were made to control it by physicians and sorcerers. One remedy suggested was to make food with loads of spices so that it would kill the bacteria within. Thus was born the spicy, tangy chaat. Due to the partition, there was a loss of East Bengal cooking. The style of cooking they used is considered superior to the West Bengal style of cooking. They have more complex flavors that are being developed. Nowadays, there are barely a few restaurants that use the East Bengal style of cooking, and hence its cultural heritage is lost. When it comes to Goa, the Portuguese did influence a majority of the Goan cuisine. The staple poi and pau were introduced by none other than the Portuguese themselves. We Goans modified the recipe by using toddy instead of yeast, which gave it an airier texture and feel. We Goans also made our own modifications to the once Portuguese recipe. Hence, we started making catrache pau and cancon, which is ring bread. Goans, from time immemorial, have been making sannas as an accompaniment with curries. Sannas were popularly made even before the Portuguese. The Portuguese also brought vinegar, meat, and pork to Goa, which crucially impacted the Goan Catholic cuisine. Tomatoes and potatoes were not accepted by the Hindus until the late 20th century. It is said that the Hindus started using them only when it was suggested to mix cod liver oil with tomato juice to mask the taste of the oil. This was done during the typhoid epidemic in Goa to prevent more people from becoming sick. A plethora of dishes were introduced by the Portuguese and adapted by the populace, including kafrial, vindaloo, balcha, croquettes, and many others. The glorious chicken kafrial is believed to have its roots in the Mozambican Galina piri piri. Piri piri is essentially a fiery, hot, small chili. Likewise, sorpatel, a popular Goan pork curry, is said to have evolved from the sarapatel devised by the African slave community in Brazil. Originally, the dish started out with being called sarabulo, made in Minho, northern Portugal. It crossed the Atlantic with Portuguese invaders and landed in Brazil, where African slaves added chili, onion, and tomato and changed its name to Sarapatel. Cooked in vinegar, the stew would last much longer than normal, proving beneficial while traveling on long journeys. After the Portuguese introduced this dish in Goa, it was quickly adopted and modified by the local Goans. The wine was replaced by toddy vinegar, which acts as a preservative as well as adds sourness. The predecessor of today's Vindaloo is Carne de Vinha de Alos, meaning wine or wine vinegar and garlic. It was made with salted pork, wine, vinegar, and garlic. The local influence added cinnamon, cloves, cumin seeds, coriander seeds, pepper, and toddy vinegar to the tangy curry. It was cooked in a traditional way in a clay pot, which was covered with another pot with water in it so as to retain moisture. This helped the meat become softer. Tragically, no one knows the original recipe accurately, as there was no written documentation done for it. Recipes were passed down to generations simply through word of mouth. Carne de Vinha de Alos recipe available today is the closest to the original. Next, we have bal chow, which is halfway between a pickle and a curry. Bal chow is made up of onion, vinegar, red chili, and spices, usually made with either prawns or pork. It is thought to have come from Macau, which was once under Portuguese control, although it may also be related to the family of Southeast Asian shrimp and chili pastes, with names like Blacan, Balachan, and Balakan. Indian modification included the addition of local spices like cloves, pepper, cumin seeds, and cinnamon to get bal chow that we have today. Despite being under the Portuguese rule for 450 years, Goans have not forgotten about their traditions. They merely modified them. Take, for example, the staple Goan food, fish curry rice and prawn curry rice. Goans have been making these dishes from time immemorial due to the large availability of seafood. When the Portuguese came to Goa, Goans incorporated onion and tomato into the curry. Goans also used to make khatkathe, which was a vegan stew made up of vegetables that were locally grown at the time. It is coming together of various seasonal and local vegetables. However, some of the constants are gourds, tubers, drumsticks, elephant foot yam, pumpkin, radish, and hog plums. All these vegetables are abundant in parts of rural Goa and easy to source. It also includes sweet potatoes, air potatoes, stems of red amaranth, pumpkin vine, and even bamboo shoots. This stew is highly nutritious. It is still made today for religious occasions and weddings, which affirms the fact that we haven't forgotten about our traditions. In conclusion, India has progressed tremendously when it comes to food. Various cuisines and dishes were lost along the way. At the same time, new styles of cooking and new dishes were created and introduced. Every dish that we have today has a rich cultural heritage associated with it. So next time you eat something, apart from thinking about how good the food tastes, remember that you are eating a dish that contains a myriad of history behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. I request the chairperson to take over, please.
Good afternoon to everyone present here. It's my privilege to be a part of Conclave 2021 student lecture series. Hearty congratulations to Dempe College for its Diamond Jubilee celebration. It's a great honor to be here. First of all, I will congratulate all the speakers of today's amazing deliberations. You all have done fabulous job by working on very relevant topics. I don't have any questions, but I have some observations and comments, which I will put it across about the first presentation by Shubha and Komal. I really felt happy to know students are thinking in terms of most important aspects of life ethics. I must appreciate the highlights made by all. Being in sports, I understand how crucial is ethics in every sphere of sports. Great presentation, I must say. In second presentation, I have actually focused on much needed issues of an hour. The awareness about counseling and the stigma associated with it. I really appreciate the efforts put by Ms. Josette Nazri to highlight the significant points related to it. The third presentation by Ms. Natasha Fernandez, topic progression of food in India from ingredients to dish. Yes, indeed, we need to address the issues associated with food. At large, agriculture, Indian traditional and heritage food varies in taste and representing the beauty of diversity in India. The diversity unite all of us when we enjoy the food from different cultures, appreciate the speaker's efforts to highlight of this diversity of food in India and the influence of different cultures on Indian food. Great job, Natasha. Overall, I must say Conclave is the best platform given to students to develop their research and presentational skill. I thank Dempe College of Arts and Science for inviting me for this session. Also, thankful to Dr. Rashida HOD of Philosophy Department for considering me for this task. Thank you. All the best to the students.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have a question for Shubha and Komal in the chat box. If a death is occurred of a player during an event of any game, is it an offense or treated as an accidental death?
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, carry on.
It was a brilliant question raised by Oreo, sir. So, if a death is occurred of a player during an event of any game, is it offense or treated as an accidental death? So, sir, I would like to give you an example saying that in Dempe itself, if anybody is found bullying, is just a majorly crime for us. So, similarly, if any player does such activities, it's not an accidental death, but it's an offense. And sometimes there is also some medications and medications which are preferred before any game. So it depends. It really depends upon the situation as to how to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience? Please feel free to ask. Okay. If there are no more questions, we will conclude this session. I would like to thank all the three speakers for their presentations, very interesting presentations. I would also like to thank their mentors for guiding them very well. I would like to thank chairperson of this session, Ms. Astrid Pereira, for giving her valuable time to all of us. Before I forget, I would like to remind all the students to give their feedback. The link has been posted in the chat box. Please give your feedback on all the three sessions and you will receive an certificate which can be used as an attendance record. I would like to also thank the convener of IQAC, Dr. Shilpa Samant, and all the committee members for putting conclave together. I would like to also thank the principal of Dembe College for always encouraging us and supporting us in all the way. I would like to mention especially Advocate Auro, who is always with us. He is a past student and also a member of the IQAC. He is always there to support us, our students. We really feel privileged when you are here with us, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you. You too.
Yeah. So I request all of you to give your feedback, and we would like to conclude the session here. Thank you so much.